All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Today, what I want to talk about is this idea of struggle. We want to talk about the middle way. And it kind of came about. I was sending an email to someone, and I almost typed in there, "Have a happy Memorial Day." And suddenly, the inappropriateness of that phrase, it just kind of reached out and shook me. And I know you've seen the post on Facebook. You've seen people reminding one another that Memorial Day is not only about barbecues and automobile races and opening beach season and all those things, but it is a day for us to remember in whatever way is appropriate for us. It is a day for us to remember those who have sacrificed their lives in service to the military of their country. And I would say that, it even goes beyond our own country. I mean, young people in countries all over the world are called into service and sent into battle and give their lives fighting for an idea. And I think we need to remember what that is all about and remember what they have given for their idea, whether we agree with their idea or not. We must remember the sacrifice that they have made. And what we want to remember is that what war is, it's more than just weapons and shooting and bombing and killing and those things that we typically associate with war. But war is really an idea in action. The conflict that manifests itself in war fighting is a conflict that starts in consciousness. It is a conflict that starts in mind. It is the idea of rightness and wrongness. This is why Rumi says, beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Someone has said that war is the result of a failed foreign policy. And I think they were alluding to this fact, that it is in the mind that this all starts. It is in the ideas. It is in the attachment to the belief that this starts. The Buddha said that if you become too attached to the idea of peace, you will wind up fighting for peace. You got to think about that for a minute. If you become too attached to the idea of peace, the peace has to be your way, then you're going to wind up fighting for your way, for your peace. So what this means to me and what this means to this topic we're going to discuss this morning, the middle way, is that unless and until human consciousness changes, and until the cause of wars changes, the ideas, the way that people hold on to ideas, the self-motivating, self-interest ideas that people have to promote the things that are good, that they believe are good for them, even at the expense of others. All of these limiting ideas in human consciousness that are the cause of war, they must change. They must change. Otherwise, we will be sending our young people off to do battle with other people's young people forever and forever and forever. And we will be holding Memorial Days and parades forever and forever and forever. So what I invite us to consider today as you're listening to these ideas is how can you and I as individuals, how can we begin that most important work of all of human experience, that most important work of changing consciousness, of moving beyond these ideas of right doing and wrong doing, of moving beyond these ideas of struggle, and of allowing that peace which passes understanding to well up from within. And I know it's tempting for each of us when we start to discuss these ideas to immediately turn and look at another country, another religion, another something, and say to ourselves, yeah. How do we go about fixing them? How do we go about changing them? And of course, the minute we do that, we are the problem. We are the flip side of the consciousness that says my way is right and your way is wrong. And there's no negotiating with you or discussing with you. There's only subduing you, which is the mindset that is the problem, that is behind the wars that we are experiencing in this world today. So I invite you to take these ideas and start first by turning within and asking ourselves, how do we as individuals, how do we kind of put that oxygen mask on ourselves? You know, you're on the plane and the masks drop and they tell you put yours on first before you try to help others. Otherwise you'll have nothing to give, nothing to be helpful with. And how do we undertake that task, if you will? I hate to call it a task because that makes it sound like a struggle, but how do we undertake that deliberate conscious activity of allowing our consciousness to change, allowing our consciousness, if you will, to be kind of that crack through which the light comes into the world. You may remember one time I was talking, Leonard Cohen had written a song and there was a little poem in it that he had quoted. And he said, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And it was kind of telling people, stop waiting for it to be perfect before you begin. Stop looking and criticizing at the chinks in everybody else's armor. And recognize that we all have our imperfections. But it is through that crack that the imperfection gets in. That the perfection gets in. And when I listened to that, I kind of took it the other way, and I thought, well, maybe it's through the crack that the perfection gets out. The perfection is already within us. We are created out of that perfection. We are kind of surrounded by this ignorance of human consciousness and human belief. And something has to be an opening to allow a greater idea, a greater way of thinking, a greater way of acting, a greater way of being to enter that stream of consciousness so that it can have its healing effect on that stream of consciousness. And I believe that comes through us as individuals as we allow ourselves to separate our consciousness from the problem and to align our consciousness with the perfection and then to allow that perfection to shine through us to do its healing work. So this idea of the middle way, of course, comes from Buddhism. We will find similar ideas in many teachings, but probably the most popular is of the Buddha. And the idea is the Buddha was born into a life of privilege. He was born a prince, and his father did not want him to experience the troubles of the world. He was concerned that if his son became aware of the pain and the suffering of the world, his son would become entangled with that and want to do something about that, to become a great spiritual leader, to do something about that. And his father was trying to keep him from that path in life, and trying to keep him into the political arena, trying to keep him into the family business of being princes and kings and rulers. Now, of course, this is mythology, and this is not just about the Buddha. This is about each and every one of us. This is about how, as we come into the world, our parents try to protect us from the world. They try to keep us from seeing the world as it is, in hopes that somehow we won't go out and kind of make the same mistakes, if you will, that everybody else makes. Learning experiences. That somehow we will be shielded from the horrors of war, from the horrors of the reality of man's inhumanity to man. So the Buddha lived a life of privilege. Everything he wanted, he had. It was all there. And the palace was so arranged that he couldn't see anything that his father didn't want him to see. So there were no old people, there were no sick people, there were no dying people. And one day the Buddha managed to get out of the palace and go through the village, and he became aware of poverty. He became aware of sickness. He became aware of suffering. He became aware of death and dying. Excuse me. And he wanted to know about it, and he wanted to do something about it, and he wanted to know how to alleviate the suffering of mankind. So he left a life of privilege and of luxury and indulgence, and he moved out into the woods. Now, in those days, there were people who were called the forest dwellers. You know, they lived in the woods. They lived without any means of sustaining their being. Beggars, if you will. They had no clothes. They had no shelter. And they were ascetics. And what they were doing is they believed that by strict discipline, by the power of will, by the power of the mind, by this idea of struggle, that they could somehow control, if you will, the body, and through that they would free the mind and they would reach enlightenment. And the Buddha went and studied with them, and again the mythology tells us that he had so mastered the discipline that he was living on 1 grain of rice per day, and he was very near death. But he had not yet reached enlightenment, not yet experienced, as I would say, the presence of the divine, the divinity within himself, within all things. And as he was sitting there, a raft was floating down the river, and on the raft was a teacher and a pupil, a music teacher. And the music teacher was instructing the pupil how to tune the instrument. And the music teacher said, now, if you tune the string too loose, it will not play. And if you tune the string too tight, it will break. To be tuned properly, it must be tuned to the middle. And we're told it was at that moment that the Buddha realized that the path to enlightenment was not going to be in struggle. It was not going to be in asceticism. It was not going to be in using the power of the mind to force the body into discipline, to reject, if you will, the very food that the body needed, the very water that the body needed, the shelter, and those things. Nor was the answer to the issue of enlightenment and pain, the causes of pain and suffering, and the elimination of pain and suffering, and in our case, the elimination of wars. Nor was it in indulgence in the life of privilege, but there had to be a middle way. There had to be something in the middle. There had to be a way to find in the middle this sense of letting go of struggle. And this sense of letting go of unconscious indulgence and finding a way in the middle that would lead to enlightenment. And as the Buddha went through his experiences after that, of course, the ascetics rejected him. They told him that he had abandoned the path, that he was selling out, if you will, to the establishment, as we would have said in the 60s. But yet he realized that he needed to follow the middle way. And as he became closer and closer to enlightenment, again, the mythology of his life tells us that he was brought into temptations, very similar to the story of the temptations of Jesus. He was brought into temptations, and he was offered, if you will, the temptations, or as I would say, the distractions of the world. And it's very important when we understand this mythology. It was not that he was unaware of what was going on. In a similar matter, Jesus was not unaware of what was going on. In the mythology of Christianity, Jesus was having a conversation with the tempter, right? With the Satan. And of course, in the Aramaic culture, the Satan was one who would take you away the one who would mislead you. So Jesus was also aware of the temptations that were going on, the distractions of the world. And the Buddha took one finger and put the finger to the ground that he was sitting on. He was aware of what was going on. He was aware of the distractions that were before him. But he was centered. He was centered in that the fullness of truth, the fullness of being is right here, right now. I don't need any of that. See, I don't need any of your distractions. And I don't want to any longer be engaged in them, to have my mind entangled with the struggles of the world, because they take us away from the true purpose of finding the peace within. And it was at that moment then that he achieved his enlightenment. And what that means to us, of course, that is a story from another culture, a culture much different than our own. But it is also a story about the evolution of each and every one of our souls, about the growth of our souls. And in our culture, what we must be aware of is keenly in our culture, the one that we have grown up in, the one that has influenced us, and possibly because it was influenced by people who lived in Mesopotamia in the Middle East and grew up in a desert, and living was hard. But our culture says that it must be hard if it is worth anything. We have to make it hard to make it worth something. There has to be a sense of strain, a sense of struggle, in order for it to be valuable. And in the mythology of this culture, if you look at where it starts with the story of the Garden of Eden, what has happened is that we have taken that story, whatever it originally meant, we have taken it and it has assumed the meaning of us against ourselves. That we human beings are fighting and struggling against ourselves. That there is something inherently wrong with being human because of what transpired in the garden, because we trusted our own nature, because we listened to our own desires, because we ate of the forbidden fruit, if you will. That now we are tainted, now we are damaged goods, and we must struggle against our own sense of intuition, of inspiration. We must not even trust the ideas of our mind because they are wrong, you see. And you get that through the traditional religions of our culture. Some religions will tell people don't meditate because when you meditate, the ideas that you get, well, they might come from the devil and they might be trying to tempt you. So we can't even trust the ideas that come into our mind. And we have to struggle. And there has to be this sense of fighting and struggling and making ourselves worthy and somehow, if you will, fighting our way back into heaven. And these religions are typically full of rules and regulations that must be followed. And they are very, very concerned and focused on behavior, what people do. The behaviors is that which is all important, and the rules and regulations focus on the behavior. And in some traditions, we're told that there were as many as 617 different things that people either needed to do or avoid doing during that day if they were to maintain their religious or their spiritual life. And of course, to be able to remember to do or not to do 617 different things each and every day is almost an impossible idea. And this idea of struggle is so ingrained within us. It is just so ingrained in our culture that you can even see that there are some ideologies that completely define themselves by what they are struggling against. In other words, they don't really have an identity of what they are for, but their identity is completely created out of what they're against. They constantly have to have something to fight against, whether it be a religious ideology or a political ideology. It doesn't matter, but there are people who cannot exist without their enemies, without having something to struggle against. And there's this belief, this ingrained belief that somehow that struggling, somehow that fighting, somehow somehow that is what is going to purify. That is what is going to make people better. That is what is going to make people whole. You know, I remember years ago here in the Charlotte area, there were some televangelists who were in great trouble with the media for some things that they were doing financially inappropriate. And when they were exposed and when they were caught, they went before the cameras and they said, you see, we're being persecuted, and that must mean that we're good, because it is the good people who get persecuted. And that was their way of rationalizing. That was their way of expressing the belief that in this struggle, somehow there had to be a struggle, that if you're good, there had to be a struggle. There had to be a struggle in order to be good, and once you were good, there was more of a struggle because people would persecute you. And there was this idea that the sense of struggle was all important. And of course, they were found guilty of the charges against them. They had been misusing the finances of the organization and wound up being convicted of that. So the idea that they were being persecuted because they were so good was a self-inflicted idea, if you will, a rationalization or justification. But my point is that it comes out of the belief that there must be a struggle. In order for it to be valuable, there must be a struggle. And if the most important thing in our lives is our contact with God, then we, out of that mindset that which is valuable must be a struggle, we will make that hard. We will find a way to make that hard. We have to. We have to, in order for it to be worth anything. I just remember many years ago, it was like maybe 35 years ago, we were at a family outing and company picnic kind of thing, and we were going to play miniature golf. And there was a little guy with us, and I don't know, he might have been like 3 years old at the time. Never played miniature golf before. And when we went up to the first hole, we went up to where you just put the tee box, where you put the ball down on that little rubber mat. Somehow it was decided that he was going to go first. So his dad explained the whole thing to him, told him everything he needed to know. He said, the object here is to take that ball and get that ball in the hole down at the other end of this little putt-putt thing. And the little guy standing there, as cute as could be, had his little putter in his hand, looking down at his little brightly colored ball, looking up at his father. And his father said, yeah. He said, what you want to do is get the ball down there into the hole. And the little guy shook his head like he understood, reached down, picked up the ball, walked down to the hole, and dropped the ball in the hole and looked up at everybody like, what's so hard about this? And of course we all laughed, He got the essence of what it was, get the ball in the hole. See, but he made it too easy. He didn't struggle with it. He didn't hold the putter just right. He didn't try to bounce the ball off the rail and all the other things that the game is designed to do to make it difficult. So what we want to keep in mind then is that the society that raised us, the society that we grew up in, and the consciousness that we have accepted, and perhaps another way of putting it is the consciousness that seemed appropriate to us when we came into this world, is wrapped up in this idea of struggle. That if we are to grow, if we are to reach whatever enlightenment means to us, if we are to experience the presence of God, that it needs to be something that is a struggle. We need to do it by doing inhuman things, fasting and abstaining and repeating things over and over and over again, and withdrawing from the world and living in caves and monasteries and all of those things that we make it hard. And what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves a very simple question. What within us believes it needs to be hard? What within us needs this sense of struggle to create an identity for itself? What part of us, if you will, thrives on the fight and lives to fight? And it is the ego. The ego. So the ego within us seems to exist for the purpose of struggle. its purpose seems to be to lead us into and through and out of the fight and make sure that we win. And if there's no fight to be had, it will find one. It will create one. It will make one. It will find an enemy. It will create an enemy. It will make an enemy. It will give us something to struggle with and against, even if it is to struggle with and against ourselves. And what has happened here in the evolution of human consciousness is that the ego has led us to believe that in order for us to experience God, it must be a struggle. And that way the ego gets to be in charge. It gets to be in control. It gets to tell us if we can just go by living on 1 grain of rice a day, then we will succeed. If we can completely abandon all of the needs of our bodies and achieve ultimate control, ultimate domination over our bodies, physically, through yoga, through the things that we can do to assume these incredible positions, that if we can do all of these things, that then we can reach enlightenment. Then we can get to the point where we can let go of it all. Enlightenment being letting go of it all. So we are tricked, if you will. We are tricked into staying over to the extreme of struggle. We believe that our religious or spiritual growth has to be a struggle, that we must work hard, that our practice must be difficult, that in order to evolve spiritually, we have to struggle, and it becomes too difficult for us and we can't do it. Now the other side of that, the other extreme, is of course the string being too loose, which is kind of a way of saying, well, listen, if we're all created out of that goodness anyway, if the divine has created us out of itself in the first place, and if it has created us for the purpose of knowing it, of experiencing it, of awakening to our spiritual nature, of reaching enlightenment, well, then it's only a matter of time, you see. And why do anything? Why even try? Why even bother? Excuse me, because that which knows everything certainly knows how to do this. So I will just eat, drink, and be merry, and when God is ready, God will tap me on the shoulder, wave its magic wand, and I will be enlightened. And that is just as much a temptation or a delusion of the world, just as much as fear and struggle is an idea that keeps us entangled and keeps us from our ultimate purpose. This idea of doing nothing and indulging is also a very, very tempting idea. It sounds wonderful. I don't do anything. I just sit around and somehow it's going to happen. Somebody else is going to do it for me. Someday I'll awaken and it's going to be great. And that too keeps us stuck. That too keeps us from moving forward. And where the middle way comes in is the middle way says it's not about struggling, and it's not about completely abandoning any conscious awareness of our purpose and our growth, but it is about coming into the middle where we remain unattached. And this for us is the hard part. If we understand then that the things that we struggle against are the things that we are attached to, it is our attachment that causes the struggle. It is our attachment to the idea of being right. It is our attachment to the idea of peace that will lead us to fight for peace. We start to come into the realization that in the middle way we have to let go. See, we have to let go. And we also realize that in not being consciously aware, not consciously, if you will, desiring our awakening and kind of doing what we can to it, but in doing absolutely nothing, that we are simply delaying, that we are simply avoiding, and that we will not reach enlightenment that way, because enlightenment requires a decision on our part. It requires a conscious cooperation on our part. Okay. So while it's true then that we may be able to just kind of languish in the world and do the things of the world, and that someday the awakening will happen. The awakening will happen through a process of our desiring it, of our willing to cooperate with it. And then we must still begin, if you will, the work of the spiritual growth. So either extreme keeps us from where we want to be, what we want to be, to walk that middle road. And what this means then is really a sense of remembrance, which is appropriate on Memorial Day. But instead of remembering war, what we are remembering is what we are, who we are, what created us, and what is our destiny. So in order to do this, we have to be willing to let go of each and every preconceived notion that we hold. We have to be willing to recognize then that a religion is simply an idea or a collection of ideas. A political ideology is simply a collection of ideas. A country is simply an idea. You know, I know most of you are old enough to remember when they actually had paper encyclopedias, and the encyclopedia salesman would come to your house and knock on the door and try to sell you this beautiful set of books. And then every year they had supplements. They had supplemental volumes that you would purchase to kind of update the encyclopedia on what was discovered new in that previous year. And the bulk of what was contained in those supplements, excuse me, I'm going to drink a water here. The bulk of what was contained in those supplements were new maps. The boundaries of the countries on the face of the earth were in such a state of flux, and still are in such a state of flux, that every year they had to print new volumes just to show people where the borders were. And why is that? See, the borders are nothing more than an idea. There's nothing more than a sense of, well, this side of the river is mine, and that side of the river is yours. And then later on they say, well, no, it's this side of the river plus 50 miles, and all these other things. So as the consciousness changed, as the political struggle went on, as the clash of wills went on, so the borders would change, and they were kind of a living testimony to how the conflict in human consciousness continued on. So the country is an idea, the borders are an idea, and those ideas are constantly changing. And we have to be willing to accept then that everything that we have ever believed, and everything that we do believe, may simply be is just an idea. And it may be subject to change, and perhaps it should change. And we have to ask ourselves if holding on to that idea, if our attachment to this idea of rightness and wrongness is keeping us from experiencing that which is already present, that which is already here. So one thing that we can do as we deliberately embark the path of the middle way is to become aware of our attachments. What is it that you don't want to let go of? What is it that if I came to you and said to you, I need to take this away from you. For your own good, I need to take this away from you. What is it that you would say, oh, no, you're not going to get that. Whatever that is, you're going to have to get it out of my cold, dead hands, because I'm not going to give that up, you see. And whatever that is an attachment that is very likely holding you back. Whether that attachment be a political idea, whether it be a religious idea, whether it be a financial idea, it doesn't matter. It is an idea that is holding you back. So what we want to do when we're walking the middle path is simply to remember what we are. It is mindfulness. It is coming into the constant awareness of our presence with the divine all about us. Osho asks us, start to think about what you are, and we think, well, I'm my body. I am this body, but you're not this body. This body is certainly part of the experience that we're having here on earth, but we are not our bodies. And where does our body end? We think, well, our body ends at our skin. That's where our body ends. There's all this stuff inside, and then there's our skin, and the skin just kind of holds it all in, and that's where our body ends. And he says, well, what about your breath? When you breathe in, isn't the air part of your body? And when you breathe out, isn't the air part of your body? And as you breathe out and the plants breathe in, isn't part of your body entering their body? And as they breathe out oxygen and you breathe it in, aren't your bodies now part of the same something, the same whole, the same oneness? And if you think of your food, where does your food come from? And your food comes from the soil. And isn't the soil then part of your body? And when your body dies and it is put back in the soil, doesn't your body become the soil? And aren't then all of our bodies to some degree entwined? All of our molecules commingled? And where does the soil come from? But the soil comes from the universe. And if we stay along those lines of remembrance, then what happens is that we start to remember that we are much more than the ideas that have been holding us back. It becomes easier for us to let go of the idea of this piece of dirt is mine and that piece of dirt is yours when we recognize that this piece of dirt is both of our bodies, that we are both one with it, that there's a unity of life, and that we are connected through it. And you can see how it leads to a deeper respect then for the resources of the planet and the way that we interact with the planet and the water and the soil and the air. And everything starts to reflect this new awareness, this middle road awareness. Some things that we can do in our practice, of course, is mindfulness. As you sit down to eat, what is it that is eating? But it is the presence of the divinity within. It is the very life of God that has animated these bodies. It is the very life of God that is the consciousness that is behind these bodies. That's what is eating. And where does the meal come from that it is partaking? It comes from its very self. From its very self and its creation as the planet and the vegetables and the animals. And if we can allow ourselves to stay in the middle, not to indulge in the meal with a sense of unconsciousness of just shoveling food in our mouth because we've got to run and catch the train or whatever it is we need to do in the morning. And not in a sense of control in that this meal is perfect because I cooked it so and I made a lot of money and I bought the most expensive steaks and all of that kind of thinking. But can we bring ourselves into the state of awareness that through this meal we are in communion? That we are in communion with the divine within us and the divine within all things, that this meal then is a sacred experience. And to accept it as it is, as it truly is. Excuse me again. Another thing that we can do when we are having an experience of a positive emotion, excuse me, I gotta get another drink here. For example, if we meet someone we haven't seen for a very long time, we are truly delighted to see them. We are happy to see them. We are caught up in this feeling of satisfaction, this feeling of joy, and this feeling of bliss. And what we can do is we can remember in that moment that we are the bliss. That the bliss is not something external that has been put upon us by the situation, but the bliss is the very essence of who and what we are. It is the very essence of our being, and we can in that very moment, what we can do is we can experience our unity with the bliss, with the love. We in that moment lose the idea of the self. We lose the idea of the ego, and we just become, for a moment, we just become one with that experience of love. And what happens to us as we grow in this manner is we get glimpses. We get moments, perhaps ever so brief, but we get moments where we truly disassociate with all of the things, all of the ideas, all of the attachments that we have. We recognize that we are not what we think. We are not what we own. We are not what we do for a living. But that we are the witness, witnessing these things. We are the observer, observing these things. That we are a part of something that is so much bigger, so much grander than these things that we can see around us, that we experience. We feel it. We know it. We live it. And it then starts to live through us. And so this is the Emerson telling us to get our bloated nothingness out of the way. This is what we are told about dissolving the ego. So the purpose of the struggle in some religions is that we allow the ego to control the struggle long enough that the ego will get us to a point where the ego will let go and that which is within will come through. And of course that doesn't happen because it is the ego that is running the show. And the ego is not going to let go. In fact, the ego is putting on the show to keep us distracted. But in that moment of bliss, in that moment of joy, in that moment of love, wherever it is, in the smile of a child, holding a baby, bouncing a little one on your knee, playing with your pets, holding your beloved, partaking of the miracle of the meal. If in that moment we can remember who and what we are and let go of the delusions of the mind around us, then we can begin. We can begin the awakening. We can begin the letting go of the ideas of right doing and wrong doing that inevitably lead us into war, that take our young people from us, and create the need for Memorial Days. So I invite you, and I invite myself, I invite each and every soul that is honestly crying out for a deeper experience of God to consider the middle way, to be willing to let go of everything and anything that we have allowed to distract us from the path. To let go of a sense of the need of struggle, because it does not need to be a struggle. To let go of the sense that we need not do anything, because in fact our enlightenment requires our participation. But to allow ourselves to come lovingly, gently and peacefully to that middle road. So that when life says to us, but what about this? We need to get excited about this. We need to get angry about this. We need to fight and we need to struggle and we need to go do something about this. We can, as the Buddha did, take our finger and put it to the ground in front of where we are and say, this is where I need to be. And when life says to us, but what about all the wonderful things that you're missing out on and all the good things and all of the things that we could go and indulge in the luxuries of life? We can take the finger and we can put it to the ground in front of us and say, this is the luxury of life. This is where I need to be. This is the middle road. And as we do this and as others do this, as I said, this is the crack through which the light gets out. This is the crack through which the peace gets out. This is the crack through which a greater idea gets out. So that someday, human consciousness can move to the point where it too, as a whole, lets go of the struggle. Excuse me. Lets go of the distractions. And gets down to the real business of walking the middle road. The prayer of St. Francis says, O Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. I think we need to remember that we are already the instruments of the peace. And perhaps for us, the more appropriate prayer is, O Lord, let me remember that I already am an instrument of your peace. And let me remember that where there is love, there can be no hatred. So allow me to be that instrument of love, to remember that I am the instrument of love, and that I refuse to indulge in anger or in hate. And I let this love flow to me, to flow through me, to cover the world, starting the only place I can start, right where I am, but to cover the world. So that this idea of war and the necessity of war leaves human consciousness forever. Rumi was right. There is a place beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing. Let us let go of the delusions. Let us let go of the distractions. And let us take the middle road until we get to that place. You are God's instruments of love and of peace and of change. And so it is.